Sky Nelson Isaacs. Welcome back to the Neo Human Podcast. This time for the 92nd episode.
Awesome. It's great to be here, Aga.
Yeah, man, good to have you. So this time for your book, we're using your book as an excuse to get reconnected and hopefully talk about a whole bunch of different stuff. Your new book, and congratulations about it. It's called Leap to Wholeness, How the World is Programmed to Help Us Grow, Heal, and Adapt. You're also the founder of the Synchronicity Institute and all over a very, very interesting man. So how have you been? How has life been? And how are you holding up with everything that is going on in this crazy world of, pandemic and everything that is, caused because of it and about and around it?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I appreciate that. My family is doing well enough and I'm doing well enough. I would say I don't really think about how I'm doing without thinking about the whole picture of how we're all doing, because I see this as a reflection of the wholeness of who we are as a society, as a civilization. And so I am on my personal journey. There's sort of two different things. There's seeking success with like a book and with speaking and with writing and communicating, and there's the process of making money, and that's sort of where I think I'm focusing. But then there's this other focus, which is, what is my relationship with myself? What is my relationship with the whole, the bigger picture of the journey I'm on, my divine essence or my source or God, or however you think of it. What is my relationship to that? Because ultimately, I think that's what's driving the other thing. And so while I have successes and failures in my business world, what's the underlying narrative that's changing and evolving, and I feel has been making steady progress for me, is the process of self-love, the process of understanding my own inner world, so that I can see the ways in which I'm getting in my own way, in which I'm sabotaging myself, see what it feels like to be successful and to connect with people. Success in that world is like expressing who I am meant to be in the world. So sometimes I do that well and sometimes I don't. But I would say for the past year and a half, the focus of my spiritual life has been on that relationship with myself and understanding my own process, so I can get out of my way more often. And I've gotten better at it, and I fall back sometimes,
Which really is the best and the only thing that we really can do, is to understand and realize who we really are.
Yeah, and I think that I remind myself in those moments that that's something I can really give. If I can be kind to myself, then I can give that to others. And if I'm writing books but I'm not kind to myself, then it's sort of the message falls flat. So like being really authentic for me means having that relationship have a really strong foundation, the relationship with myself. Synchronicity is a phenomenon in the world that it's a reflection of our own inner world. So we're seeing the outer reflecting the inner. And so seeing events in the world as a reflection helps me look at, what do I need to look at here? What is the narrative? And like I said, it's not just my own narrative, it's a global narrative. Like for instance, you had on January 5th, this historic election in Georgia, where you had thousands of people voting that had never voted before and expressing democracy. And then the next day we had an undermining of democracy with infiltration of the U.S. Capitol, and looking at these as two different aspects of who we are as human beings, in a society that is wrestling with, what does democracy mean? What's our value in democracy? What do we stand for? It just illustrates, without a value judgment, trying not to value judge, because I do bring my own perspective to this, but it illustrates a bigger narrative of what it means to be human right now and what we are trying to address. Because we can't understand what we're trying to address just by looking through our own eyes. We have to look at the world as a whole and start to piece together all these different things that are happening as part of a bigger message. That's my view of it.
What is the bigger message?
What is the bigger message?
Yeah, based on your understanding. It's interesting that you brought up January 6th, and I think this is an interesting point of conversation because I disagree actually with your portrayal, and I'm saying it as an immigrant. But I'm interested to know the big picture that you are seeing as the whole. What is that? What is the ideal outcome? What is the ideal situation? Because without a context, all these evaluations are meaningless. Where are we right now and where we are headed, based on which we can determine what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. Like, it's not about right and wrong. It's about understanding the underlying narrative. So let's explore that. So what does democracy look like? It looks like people having the right to vote, having the right to express themselves. Both of these events characterize the expression of people's views. I think that in the case of the January 6th event, there were people there who expressed that they were not being heard by the government, but they have representation, and they're not seeing the ways in which people of color are being oppressed by not having the right to vote or not having access to voting. So there's sort of a not seeing the narrative of what I see as, white people being enfranchised, having the rights and access to these political institutions. And in the case of infiltrating the Capitol, not really having a consequence. The unequal distribution of justice, if that was black people infiltrating the Capitol, I think that we would have seen a much different, more violent response. So I think the visibility of injustice, or the unequal application of justice, I think is what that shows. Not that either side was right or wrong, but it illustrates the differences that these two different groups of people experience in our justice system. Does that make sense, my view there?
Yeah, there are plenty of people of color on the side of people who, as you were saying, infiltrated the Capitol on January 6th, who voted for Trump, who, it's not that they feel that they're not being heard, it's that they don't trust and believe in the system anymore. And democracy itself, to me, is not a competent or efficient kind of a system in this day and age, because this system has worked for as long as it has on the basis of very limited channels of information, outlets of news, of interpretation of information and distribution of them. And so our reality was curated very, very carefully through newspapers and radios and TV and all those things. So even the differences of opinions were very minuscule, basically. And it was a given that if you lose an election, which is your only way to pursue some kind of a political intention or political direction, you just shut up until 4 years later, and that's what it is. And meanwhile, you entertain yourself with movies and food and sex and whatever. But what has happened is that we have been given these devices that is like a megaphone in the hand of every single person. And I think there is an intention by people who are the owners of this virtual reality that we're breaking through it. This, as Gore Vidal called it, the cage, that we don't even know what it looks like because we've never seen it from the outside.
Right.
And there are people who are hell-bent on keeping this division going between left and right, liberal and conservative, white and non-white. And I think it's completely wrong. I think it's completely, I grew up in Iran. I used to wake up at 7 in the morning in our Friday, which was our holiday, to watch 1 hour of NBA that was being shown on one channel because I love Michael Jordan. I didn't care that he was black. And then I grew up as a teenager. I loved James Hetfield of Metallica. I didn't care that he was white. Whatever they did resonated with me. And it became my life mission to get to America. When I got to, it took me a long time to get to America. I lived in Canada for 11 years. And I dealt with a variety of different people. And I realized that you're either cool or you're not cool. It doesn't matter what color you are. And I don't see it like that at all. And I think there are a lot of well-intended people, especially white people, since we are talking about race, who are really falling for this authoritarian and totalitarian intention of divide and conquer. That the only people who attacked the Capitol were white people. The only people who are not getting vaccinated are white people. The only problem that we have is because of white people. And I completely disagree with it. I don't think a white kid in Kansas, for example, is more privileged than Obama's kids, as an example. Or
so let me respond to that a little bit.
Yeah.
This is a great conversation. The issue is not whether people individually appreciate white athletes or black athletes or people in general. It's about these systemic processes like redlining, which have kept black people out of the housing market historically. It's about these systemic things that black people experience, which are different from white people. It's not that white people are racist. It's that the system is built on race.
That's how it's being portrayed, though. That is how it's being portrayed by critical race theory and other things that are now being used as mandatory gateways, basically, through institutions. Some of the friends of the show that I'm going to have in later episodes, they are going through lawsuits exactly because they're being pushed away from academia on the basis that they're white. On the basis that
that's really hard, and it's complicated, and I definitely empathize with that. And I don't know the answers or the solutions. So just trying to point to the pieces of information and connect whatever dots we can in the ways we can. And part of my research is on the science of wholeness. So I use this example of a hologram, because a hologram is an amazing piece of technology. You have a piece of film, and instead of looking at a photograph, you expose it in such a way that you can see different angles of the object. So if I'm looking at a face, I can see the left side of the face. I can move over here, I see the right side of the face. But it's just one flat piece of film. So it's this illusion. And what's amazing, if you think about it, when you look at the film, like in the middle of it, one point, you and I are looking at the same physical thing, because we're looking at the same piece of paper that's got silver halide or whatever it is exposed on it a certain way. But the interference pattern from the laser coming through it is making it appear like there's a face floating in space right in front of me. What I see is the left side of the face, and there's a mole on it. What you see is the right side of the face, and there's no mole on it. So we see these different things, and if we try to explain to the other person what we see, we would disagree. And so my research is actually showing that these are the same equations that describe quantum field theory and the underlying physics of the physical cosmos. And so in a sense, it really is like a hologram. And it makes me wonder if this is part of the experience of the world, that we look at it with our eyes and we see one thing, and somebody else looks at it and they see a different thing. And our job is to try and back away from our filters. Like, I've got my filter that I expressed, and I want to own that, and back away so I can see through your eyes, or even both of us can see what's all the pieces together that are there as a whole. And that's what I mean by wholeness in the book, Leap to Wholeness. How can we get better at taking off our glasses and seeing what's really present? And I don't have an answer for that, but it's an exploration into how we need to do that as human beings. I will say one more thing about that, to direct sort of away from the specifics of, because I don't hold a view that I'm going to stick to and argue without listening. I think it's really important for us to see each other's views and be able to be open to them. And I am wanting to do that. So what I'm interested in, I think that the cosmos itself is conspiring to reinforce our beliefs about the world. And I believe this long before any of the stuff going on right now. This is my exploration into synchronicity. A synchronicity is an event in the world which matches our inner experience and shows us, like when I would go to a open mic and musically, I'd go there to show up and maybe play, and somebody would invite me on stage to play, and it was like a synchronistic opportunity that was like an expression of my desire to show up and play. How the world shows up with opportunities that match our interest and intention, and also shows us information that matches our beliefs and mindset. So I think that life itself is conspiring to entrench us in our points of view. And it's our job to use these experiences to try and pull out of those points of view and not get pulled into that argument. And I think you're saying the same thing. I think you're ascribing it to a group of people that are in control, and I see it as a bigger sort of life force that's in control, that's guiding these processes and bringing us into conflict. But the goal ultimately of that conflict is to evolve into a broader state of mind that can see the differences and still love each other and interrelate in those differences.
Yeah, so I think one thing that needs to be said is that whatever definition and whatever terms that we are using is as limited as our cognitive ability to experience this vast, endless amount of information. So wholeness that we are using, for example, or conflict or whatever, they are not the objective definition of those concepts. They are definition based on our own understanding of whatever that is going on, which is perfectly fine. But when you say conflict, I see it as a universe, as an ocean that has absolutely no intention to respect any of the structures that we as humans or any other species have erected, for lack of a better term, and consider it to be objective reality and objective truth, and it is not. So a wave will come and collapses the sandcastle that we have created and built. It could be our culture, it could be our philosophy, it could be anything. It could be our physics and mathematics, that they're working for as long as they work. But what I'm saying is that there are people who have the intention to rule others as our betters or elites or whatever, and they've managed to curate this reality based on the information that they have made the choice how to present it, how to interpret it. And so we've watched movies. I've been thinking about this a lot, that our experience of life must be very different with people who were living when movies were not around or books were not around. Because
you're influenced by the movies?
No, because we're used to this structure that there is a beginning and there is an end. And based on that, there are good people, there are evil people, and good people and evil people. They're very comic book kind of a presentation of them. But it is being used, caricatures, exactly. It is being used in our day-to-day life. That now they're saying, hey, for example, if you don't wear a mask, you're a bad person. If you're not taking a vaccine, you're a bad person. If you're wearing a mask, you're a good person. And there are millions of people who are going along with it. Well, this is exactly why witches, so-called witches, were burnt. This is exactly why a lot of people in dark ages, scientists, mystics, they were executed because they were going against the narrative. And the narrative had determined what is good, what is bad. And they also believe that this is universal. This is objectively good and objectively bad. So this is what I'm saying.
Right. I think that's a good point. And one twist on that I think is useful is and I've brought this up in conversations with people who are on the side of vaccination, which I am, but I don't know how I feel about the politics of it. I think that's a very complex issue, and I respect the different difficulties of that whole debate and the globalness of it. But when we're talking about the need to vaccinate or the requirement to vaccinate, there's a sort of a missing piece which I turn to, which is equity. That you have people in other countries, like in African countries, who have not had access to vaccines. And I think in the debate around this country where we're just talking about, is it a control issue? Are we being mandated or not? What's my personal rights to refuse or not? We're actually losing track of this, what I think is an even more compelling ethical argument, which is that even if we all agreed we should take the vaccine, we don't all deserve to take it before other people have taken it. There's a supply issue, and the equitable distribution of vaccines to people around the world, I think, is a more ethical issue than some of these other ones. And so it doesn't trump these other conversations, but it's not even. I don't think it's as simple as just saying yes we should or no we shouldn't. It's actually a question of, what's the equitable access to this. So I just think I use that as an example of the conversation is even more complex than we realize in the moment. And there's always some broader story. I think wholeness is about how big of a story can we hold? can I hold a story that reflects my facts and my views and your views at the same time, and even then expand it even further to include people in other countries and what their views might be, and other religions, what their views might be. And I think what we need as humanity is the cognitive ability to expand our story, and we don't really have that. We get caught into a particular set of facts or beliefs or views. I feel quite in between, where I talk about science from a scientist perspective, but I also push the boundaries of what science is. Synchronicity is not a well-established phenomenon. So I fight really hard to do that, to make it established. At the same time, I'm sort of in between these worlds. And I think that's an example of just continuing to expand our container or our story. How big of a story can we hold? And when we look at just a tiny part of the story, we're just missing some of the other people's experiences, what it's like for other people. And that's why I bring up those two initial experiences on January 5th and January 6th. If most of us look at that through a lens or a story that's just not quite big enough to really understand what's the human struggle that's coming out in this dialogue. And I don't know that any of us know what it is, but it comes closer to compassion for each other, having empathy for each other, and understanding that there is another view besides mine that has validity if I can open myself to it on either side.
Yeah, I think the conflict is what it's always been, that whether individual rights come first or a collective comes first. And a huge problem.
I think that's too simplistic.
No, but this is how it's being seen by millions of people.
I agree.
And one of the biggest problems that is, kind of justifies all the double standards and hypocrisy that is going around is that there are a group of people who can decide what is good for the collective with whatever kind of a reason. It can be political, it can be scientific, it can be spiritual, or whatever. And now this is a very vital kind of a moment because of a technology that we have. And we are seeing the model that is being presented as the alternative to what we have, which is the Chinese model, that you have a social credit system, that they're like, hey, we are going to have artificial intelligence on top of governance in a way that people are being, again, curated in the same way that we used to curate our reality through movies and all of that, but we're going to do it through psychology and through grading people, like social credit system, that if you walk a certain way, you got to get a lower grade, or if you take a certain medication, you got to get a higher grade. So this is a concern that people have, and I think it's a very valid concern, whether or not we are being, as you said, compassionate and loving. I think that is a matter of individual recognition and realization, because love has no meaning without hate in its contrast. You have darkness for light to have any kind of a meaning. So
But darkness is not hate. Darkness is ignorance.
No, I just use the darkness as an example to...
Yeah.
I don't even want to say two sides of a different coin, because it's one thing. This quantum reality that we're experiencing is not binary. It's not good and bad. But one level beyond that good and bad is that you understand that you need bad for good to have a meaning. You need war for peace to have any kind of a meaning. And beyond
but love and hate aren't that way. Love is this. I even don't like that word. It's not about loving each other. Yeah, it's more about being authentic and opening up ourselves vulnerably to each other, honestly, without the dogma of what we believe getting in the way of seeing each other for who we are.
Yeah, but for a lot of people, this is a process. You go through a process of believing whatever it is that you believe in, and at some point you can break through it, or you don't break through it. I look at nature. You talked about equitable distribution of vaccine. Do you think that it's ethical to have an intention for equitable distribution of sunlight among trees, meaning that going around and cutting taller trees so shorter trees and smaller trees can have equitable access to sunlight?
I don't know that I agree with the comparison.
Well, what do you think about that, though?
That's certainly not in flow. We don't go about cutting trees in order to make them all the same height, but that's not exactly what equity is. Equity is allowing access to the resources that allow someone to live out their opportunities that are natural for them. It's not giving equal opportunities. It's about not having obstacles to opportunity.
Who's providing those obstacles?
Well, in the United States, there are obstacles for people of color around housing, as I mentioned earlier. Around being redlined out of neighborhoods by not being able to buy a house in those neighborhoods and being forced to rent or buy on contract.
What is the cause of that?
Cause of that is government policies. For instance, in the housing bill after the World War II that allowed that, and then the realtor agencies, I think, have put, or different agencies, different individuals or groups put these policies in place because the home ownership values change or are expected to change depending on what races are living there. So it's a complex combination of government policy and human behavior.
Yeah, the government policy is coming from politicians, some of whom are people of color. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure I could agree or disagree. Back in the 40s,
some of the people in the government
in the 40s
today,
when that was implemented, I don't think that was the case. Not
but
very
what
much.
about now?
Now, yeah. This isn't about. I'm not trying to argue whether black people or white people are good or bad. I'm saying these are institutions that are in place. I actually agree with you that government, in the earlier conversation, government is complicated. I don't think it's separate from us. I think it is us. We voted these people into office, and we have the right to call them every single day of the year, which I do, and voice my opinion. And I have the right to donate to their campaigns or to organize against them. I mean, these are all huge rights that we have in this country that we wouldn't have elsewhere. So I think the characterization that some people make that we, live in a growing dictatorship, I think is just, again, it's missing the whole story. Like there's a much bigger story in which we have so many rights. Are we really exercising them? How many people are out there on the streets really exercising their political power? Or are we engaged in kind of like living our lives and thinking the government should just do the right thing, but we don't really invest ourselves in it?
What group of people exercise their political right and freedom, and that happened on January 6th? But they were hold on one second. They were painted as criminals and insurrectionists, yet another group of people who burned down the entire cities throughout the summer, they were called peaceful protesters, and they did it for social justice, and it's okay. It didn't spread COVID. But the moment you want to have a church ceremony or whatever or a mosque or a synagogues in New York, they were shut down because they were spreading COVID. So we don't have fair and equal or equitable policymakers or so-called leaders. And Congress that you're saying who represent us, they constantly, they have an approval rating of below 30%. So they're not necessarily presenting anybody. These are people who have taken over power, and they're not giving it away. And their power is becoming more and more centralized because of big tech, because of corporate monopolies.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree.
So
again, I think that's because of us. We gave that power away. We do not hold them accountable. We allow, we purchase the products that these companies that sell us, who are then donated to government and putting their influence in government. So that's why I pull it back to synchronicity is a phenomenon that actually empowers us to do a lot in the world that we don't even realize is there. It's about sort of the karma of our journey. How do we navigate without putting the power or the blame or the giving away our power to someone else as if it's they that's doing it, and we haven't defined who they is. Are they right or left? Are we putting them in a box of ideology that agrees with me or doesn't agree with me? I think that's where we get off track because we externalize the whole thing. I see this all as an externalization of our internal war that's going on, the war in ourselves. Am I living up to my true capacity? Am I expressing myself openly, vulnerably, powerfully in ways, a lot of us, I have a habit of expressing myself with anger, right? With like when I have an opinion and I have some force behind some anger, I can say my opinion really strongly. But this, I notice in my relationship, like at home, this doesn't work. It causes the breakdown of trust. It's the same dynamic in our bigger society. Do we have the ability to come at these difficult conversations with a force that is opening and vulnerable rather than, expressing my view over yours? And I think it really all comes down to how well am I able to hold complementary views, even though I have one of them is, reflects my opinion. Can I recognize that that's my opinion and it might even change over time, and it certainly might be different for someone else? I think that's what a mature, in the 21st century, a mature human being needs to do, to hold all of that. In physics, there's this notion of complementarity. You're familiar with the wave-particle duality. You've got, is an electron a wave or a particle? Well, it depends on how you're experimenting with it.
How it's observed.
And how it's observed.
Yeah.
The observation itself is particle-like because you're observing it in a particular state. That's a localized particle. But the way it travels and the way it interacts with other particles is wave-like. And so it's not either or, it's a complementarity. And a complementarity in Niels Bohr's language is two things that are each individually true and mutually exclusive, and yet both are valid. And that's what I think we have trouble with as human beings, reconciling. And this is why science is actually an open door for us to understand at a deeper level these things that to our human minds right now just don't make sense to us. We think it's about us versus them and right and wrong. We can't get out of that frame because we don't understand these other principles of, complementarity and, heart, opening heart and mind balance and the various ways that we can become more cooperative with each other, even as we hold our own ground. So it's not about, personal rights versus collective rights. It transcends that.
Yeah, I agree. I think we agree. I think it goes back to the nature of reality, which is quantum, and our experience, which is binary. And there are those who go beyond the binary experience, and those people become mystics and prophets and enlightened people. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. And that's why I think this is a great conversation, because you and I are coming, saying these things that sound different, but I don't think they are. And I think that's useful for people to hear.
I think what is different is that you and a lot of other people have certain elements as value in the sense that we should be doing this in order to get this. I don't see it that way. I see it as there is a flow that's been going on since the very beginning, and this flow has been controlled by very small group of people, and all of that is falling apart right now. That's why everything seems so chaotic. That's why a lot of like what you're saying, that people are saying we are living in a dictatorship or sliding towards a dictatorship, because they see that the system is becoming more violent, it's becoming more coercive, but I see it as a natural reaction of people who are just losing control. But I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing that the control is being lost, because it's like, the dam we have built to stop this river, and the river is just breaking right through it. Flow is like water, right? You can't control the flow of it. You cannot control the flow of the flow. It flows whether you like it or not.
Right. So, I think that there's, this is an important example of different perspectives and how to, see, like, for a Black person who's experienced racial profiling in the justice system in their life, the system has been this way a long time. It's been violent a long time. And so for someone like me who comes from a protected middle-class family and hasn't seen those kinds of experiences, I might say, oh, yeah, the system's becoming more violent. But that's not everybody's experience. So that's an example of how I think that we don't have the bigger picture, and we are learning from each other as we go.
Are you living in California?
Yeah. And I'll say, I speak to my fellow liberals about what I think you pointed to, which is that the way that we think, I say me as part of that, but because that's where I come from, but the way that we think isn't the right way, and it comes off that way, because we're saying that people should have these rights, or people should have these laws that protect them, or we should talk this way and be this polite with our words or respectful with our words. And I understand those values. I come from a place that talks about those values, but I also understand that is an imposition if it's that it's felt like an imposition from people who don't have those same values. So I think it's about all of us understanding the nature of our values and our opinions and how those interact in the world. And it comes when we're in our heads about it and having all these ideas about who's right and who's wrong, that's where the battle is. And I think as humans, we have the capacity to drop into a broader experience of flow, one that we have when we're playing sports or music or in deep conversation with people we love. Those experiences we're all used to need to come into the public sphere and into our dialogues so that we can relate to each other in new ways that are not mental battles, but really trying to reconcile our differences and see we don't have to be the same. I think you're saying that too. We need to be able to have these really different views and be able to find some common agreement.
Yeah, I think what happened in California, just to wrap this part up, it's very interesting. We all talk for like 40 minutes, but I guess, that's the flow. But in California, what happened with respect to this recall election is a very good thought experiment for any honest liberal to think about why is it that the entire system of so-called anti-racism went against a man who could potentially become the first black governor of state of California, calling him blackface of white supremacy and all that. I'm talking about Larry Elder. And when he was attacked by a woman, pink hair, white woman in a gorilla mask throwing rotten eggs at him, nothing from any of the media, but, just imagine if this was done to like Stacey Abrams, for example, in Georgia, who's in the right kind of a tribe, right kind of a group. So this is a problem that...
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the individual actors are often a problem, the individual examples that don't, that doesn't represent me and my views, and it's unfortunate. So it's a complicated issue.
Yeah, it represents a bigger hypocrisy, though, among people who are saying, I'm not saying you, but people who are saying that we're liberal, we're inclusive, diversity, anti-racism, and the moment that a black person comes from the wrong party and the wrong tribe, all of a sudden all of that is out of a window, and it's about power, because that's what it is. It's about power. People want to be right. People want to be proven right, and they want to govern on the basis that we're right, and you just have to submit. I'm very familiar with that because I grew up in Iran. I understand that a small group of people believe that they have the will and the right of God. And, I would say the exact same thing if there is a biblical kind of a republic being formed in the United States, that they would say the exact same thing, that we have the mandate of God and we are going to govern on that basis. And it's going to be disastrous because monopolies and centralization is unnatural, and it goes against the universal flow that, as you said, we are all different. We're different pieces. We're different waves that emerge from the same ocean, and we go back to the same ocean. That's what it is.
Yeah. Well, I think you use the word hypocritical, and I think that's a great word that we can all meditate on and ask ourselves, how are my views actually in conflict with my actions or with my values? Because sometimes they are. And I don't take sides on this. I think it's absolutely something I can see in both or all parts of the spectrum, and not even as if there's poles, but it's a broad field of views that people have. And how much are we being hypocritical in our views? Do we see the whole picture? When we advocate for one view, do we see how that actually conflicts with our values in another way? That's the wholeness that I'm seeking.
All right, we agree. So let's move on to something else. I want to ask you to define synchronicity, but before that, I want to ask you about the significance of the symbol of mushroom on your hand.
Oh, yeah. You saw that.
Yes. Is it a henna tattoo?
It's a henna tattoo.
Very amazing. Is it related to psychedelics?
Well, I wouldn't say that specifically, but it's not unrelated.
Okay, let's hear it.
So my niece just got accepted into a college overseas for 4 years in Israel.
Oh, congrats.
She's going to study for 4 years. And it's a big deal for her. And so she's leaving town, and we went to spend some special time just before she left to connect with my wife and her and my daughter. And she's a good henna artist. So we went over ostensibly for her to give a henna tattoo to my daughter, but I had to get one while I was there. So, I think that's, I drew mushrooms when I was a kid too, and they're easy to draw. They represent the opening of the mind, expansion of the mind. I like all of those symbols.
So tell me a little more about the psychedelic aspect of it.
Well, I experienced psychedelics when I was in my 20s, and for me, those experiences are gateways to a deeper understanding of the world, and they're tools that can be used as many people understand. They open points of view. Just what I'm saying about wholeness. They open us up to points of view which we don't see in everyday life, because of maybe because of the way our brain is. The default mode network is online. Keeping us rooted in our fears and thoughts about things or whatever it might be. And when we peel that back and we experience the world in a more direct fashion, is my experience of it. I think we interact with the world in symbols often. This is Carl Jung's, I'm referring to Carl Jung's work on symbolism in his book, Man and His Symbols, that symbols are how synchronicity works. So if I'm imagining this cup of coffee, but if I didn't have a cup of coffee and I'm imagining, God, I really need some coffee, and it's not just my mind thinking about a cup of coffee, it's my whole, I would say my felt experience in my body, my mind, my physical, my emotions, my physical sensations, all of that is, I think, designed to anticipate reality symbolically. We anticipate the experiences that we want to have. And this is related to what I've been saying about sort of the conspiracy that the world is presenting what we anticipate. So I anticipate a cup of coffee. I feel what it would feel like to drink that cup of coffee. I'm getting anxious about the need for coffee because I'm falling asleep, whatever it might be. And then I find that my wife comes downstairs and brings me a cup of coffee saying, I had this leftover. I made a cup of coffee and I had too much. Do you want some? That's a synchronicity that is an externalization of the anticipated experience that I'm having. And I think that when that's a symbolic thing, right? I'm not necessarily, it might be tea. She might bring me tea. So it's not necessarily the literal thing, but it's the experience I'm wanting to have of being more awake that's showing up in the synchronicity. So the symbol of coffee is really alertness and the feeling it gives me in my body and the mental connection that I have. And that's going to guide on what I would say is a tree of possible branches. Which of those branches have an experience that brings me that experience? It could be a cup of tea, could be a cup of coffee. I could realize that on my desk there's an old cup of coffee sitting there, and I didn't see it before, but it solves the problem. So I look at this as looking not just for the solutions right in front of us or from the way that we in our ego think is going to happen, but looking to the whole experience. Where can I expect the needed information to come from? And that's what synchronicity is doing. And I think we have more access to that when we're in that altered state from plant medicines.
Yeah, I see it as like water being in a glass, and what psychedelics does is that it gets rid of the glass. So it's just water. And some people have so-called bad trips. It's because exactly that lack of form, lack of structure, which right. It is what it is.
Right.
Would you say synchronicity is the same as law of attraction? Because law of attraction is more of to me at least, more of a mainstream title or approach to the same principle.
Yeah, it is. And I'm trying to make it more scientific. I'm trying to say, it's not about attracting the things you think about, like wealth. It's more like karma, where you're moving along a tree. We could call the multiverse. For those listeners who aren't familiar, a multiverse is starting with a universe, and at every moment it branches into different choices, and those are different branches of the universe. So together we call them a multiverse. And what we're dealing with in life is how do we navigate that tree? So how does this experience happen versus that experience? So where were you going with that question, though? Remind me.
With the law of attraction?
Oh, the law of attraction. So I don't like to think of it as attracting things to us. It's moving through a tree to get to different places. And it's not physical places. It's places in this abstract, tree space, which is called Hilbert space in quantum mechanics. And I want to make a caveat that there's a lot of work to be done to show that this is applicable to the broader universe and not just to microscopic particles, which is the sort of the mainstream understanding. So that this is not established well in the mainstream physics. But the basic structure of a tree and the multiverse is part of mainstream physics. So the question is, can we navigate that tree in a way that brings us meaningful experiences? And I would call those the law of attraction. But we're not mystically sending out radio waves to attract the things to us. We're actually navigating a field of branches of this tree, and it's information based. It's not physical waves or signals that we're sending out into the world. And I think that's a useful distinction to make. And I'm trying to put this on a more firm scientific foundation.
Yeah, and this is, I think, exactly the point where science and philosophy and mysticism and religions, they all come together. Because they're all saying the same thing, that I think of it as becoming a conduit for the flow to go through you, rather than you try to shift the direction of the flow. That we do that all the time based on our emotions, based on our desires, without really exploring where that need and desire is coming from. And you say, I want money. Well, why do you want money? Nobody's really digging deep that why is it that I want this thing?
Right. That's so good. You're not digging deep. And it's the felt experience of the coffee that I'm anticipating. It's the felt experience of feeling safer and more secure that I'm experiencing when I want more money, maybe. And so understanding that felt experience, if I approach this with wanting more money, but then I find that I am given a free place to live for a year, and I can see that actually approaches the same experience of being more secure, then I'm going to get into a space of gratitude. I'm going to see that connection. I'm going to be happy. I think happiness is a major factor here of what the universe is trying to provide, in a sense, by giving us this what I call responsiveness. The responsive cosmos is what I would call the law of attraction. By putting us in a responsive cosmos, it's like a way for us to be happy in life and not to be disappointed with our circumstance. And we have difficult circumstances. Everyone has things that they struggle with. I'm not saying you can't struggle, but when we do have those needs met, how many of us are really good at saying, my need was met, I'm happy now? It's not human nature to really stay with that unless we really try. And I think that's part of what the essence of the felt experience is about. If you know that what you're seeking is not money, but security, then when security comes in some new form, you're able to see that and able to use it then to leverage for the next thing that you want to create in your life, rather than continuing to strive for that other thing. Know what I mean?
Yeah. Do you see that there is a risk of intellectualizing a organic process when there are objectives set? For example, happiness. Because people have their own understanding of happiness, and when they intellectually understand that or comprehend it, they will aim for those objectives. And that's one of the things that actually can mess up people's psychedelic experiences, that they have an idea of what enlightenment is, for example, and they go to the experience with that expectation. Right? Because if you're looking for happiness, the other side of that is unhappiness. If you don't get it, you'll be unhappy.
Yeah, this is another one of those things that I don't think has an opposite. I don't think it's happiness and unhappiness. I think we spend a lot of our time in dissatisfaction, striving for something that we're uncomfortable with how things are, and it's getting to a state where we are. And I'd say that discomfort with how things are is actually an internalized sense of, or an externalization of the internal sense of, I'm not happy with myself. There's something about me and what I've done and what I've created that I'm not happy with. And this is a really important part of, how I view things that I think is useful. If we can understand how much we are unhappy with ourselves, I mean, I'm speaking from my point of view, a lot of the times when I'm unhappy with my life, I'm actually disappointed with something I've done, or just my view of what I've accomplished, or how I was in that relationship, or, it's an externalization of my internal lack of acceptance or love or appreciation or alignment, whatever you want to call it, with myself. So when we can align in that way, when we can recognize, stop trying to fix the external world, but see that it's a reflection of what we're going through on the inside. That's the ownership that I'm talking about, like owning that the synchronicities that happen to me are not the world attacking me, not somebody else's fault for bailing on me. It's a reflection of what I need to go through right now to get into more alignment with myself, which isn't about not holding people accountable. It's much more subtle than just taking full ownership over everything that happens to us. But I think that's where the law of attraction really needs to go, is taking ownership over everything that happens, not just the parts that we like, but the parts that we don't like also, and seeing those not in a frame of blaming, but in the frame of how can I grow from this experience too.
Yeah, I think alignment is a perfect term, actually. I take that over happiness, even over being peaceful, because alignment has no binary values. You're aligned with a bigger thing. You're in your place. You're where you're supposed to be.
Right.
And it seems like once you're aligned, there are symbols and signs all over the place. Once you move away from yourself, once you get out of your own way, basically, then everything is a cue. It's very common, as I found out, because I started seeing 1111 at some point, just 1111 all over the place. Clock 1111, plates. And then apparently this is a common phenomena that's happening to thousands of people. They're saying 1111. But then I changed my clock. Like you see, it's not like 1 whatever, it's 1354 right now instead of 154. Yeah. And then I started seeing and then I started seeing like 1313, 1414, 1616. And why do you think this is happening?
Well, the word for this in psychology is apophenia, where your brain is programmed to see patterns. One of the things that I think is fascinating about the brain, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm speculating here, but this is based on like Carl Pribram's work that I've read, that the brain is operating in what we call the Fourier transform space, at least to some degree. In other words, and this is underlying my work I published a paper this past year establishing that quantum mechanics is essentially based on this Fourier transform space, both in space and in time. So I take this extra step of doing this in time, which is a really big leap in physics, because we don't understand time very well. It's sort of this very classical concept.
Fourth dimension, basically, right?
The fourth dimension, yeah. And when you talk about the world as a hologram, which I was mentioning earlier, you're talking about a 4-dimensional hologram in space and time. And that's a very much bigger picture and mind-bending idea than just thinking of a hologram. So where were we going with that, though?
I was just curious what your opinion is about not necessarily numbers, but the cues and symbols and signs that are being presented to
1111
aligned individuals. 1111 as an example.
So apophenia is this sense that we see patterns, and our brain operates based on these patterns. We look for things that frequency space, or the Fourier transform is a pattern matching space. That's what our brains do. So if you're sitting there and you just twitch your eye, I'll notice it, because even though it's a small change in the picture, I'll notice the pattern shift. Because if I take the Fourier transform of your picture, then a small shift in your eyelid will translate into a shift across the whole transform. So the Fourier transform space is this map that is a non-local map, or a one-to-all map of the physical space we're in. So small changes in patterns affect the whole picture. And this is something that's much bigger concept to talk about in terms of the physics of what I call holism, which is the opposite of reductionism. But to come back to the question of why do you see patterns like 1111, your experiment is great because you change it to a 24-hour clock, suddenly you're seeing different patterns. There's nothing fundamental about 1111 that's mystical or biblical. It's about your brain, and I think that this works in Carl Jung's version of your brain is got a language with this symbolic cosmos. When you make meaning out of something, it reinforces that symbol as meaningful. And it's like, I think of us as being in communication with the vast cosmos that we live in. And we're in communication through this, in this symbolic way. When the number 1111 comes up and we feel like, oh, this is great, I'm meant to be writing this paper right now. So I get more confidence, I buckle down, I write the paper, I do a great job, and I turn it in and I get an A. That reinforces this notion, because I go back and I think, well, I saw 1111, that was good luck.
Right.
And so the next time I need that kind of confidence, it's a symbol that will help, right? If 1111 can show up in my life as a symbol, which isn't objectively meaningful, but to me, it's going to give me that boost of confidence. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is also true of negative effects, right? So I'm reading about some political thing, and I see the numbers, 666, and I associate that with something biblical that's evil. But that's something I've patterned myself to do, and I'm going to suddenly get scared. I feel it in my body. I feel like anxious about it. So these are all, I think we need to pull back and see that our brain is doing these things. It's pattern matching, but it's not just pattern matching. It's part of a responsive system in the cosmos that reinforces those patterns. It's kind of like a Google search, where once I search for something, I start to get that search back again in my ads. And once I take an action in the world and I start to believe in something, I start to get that showing up in my life, just like the Google search, synchronistically, though.
So would you say synchronicity is a kind of algorithm?
Yeah. Well, the subtitle of my book is How the World is Programmed to Help Us Heal, Grow, and Adapt. The programming is this responsiveness, that it's meant to bring us this sort of karmic response to our choices. So choices are sort of the whole thing. What kinds of choices are we making? Are they coming from more openness, opening our minds, opening our hearts, more expansiveness? Or are they coming from really believing that we know the way and that we're going to shut down the options? Those are sort of the one way of characterizing choice. And the algorithm is kind of like the Matrix. It's like bringing us these different opportunities, different situations, to bring us different experiences. In my view, the purpose of that is not to bring us the right thing or the better thing or make us better people, but to help us heal and grow. And I landed on those words because I think that they are expansive. The ways that you want to heal in life or grow in life are yours. The ways that I want to heal and grow in life are mine. It's more about alignment. We're each coming into more alignment with who we want to be in the world. But it is about healing in the sense that we come into the world after a while with patterns of wounds that we've had, ways that we've been hurt, ways that we're reactive, and understanding those layers of patterning can only be beneficial, because then we can have more choice about, oh, I don't want to react when you say that word a certain way. I'm going to just stay calm and sort of inquire and come back into equanimity. It allows us more options to not be reactive and in conflict all the time. So peeling back those layers of patterning is what I'm saying, why the world is programmed to help us do that, which leads us to what I call healing. And somebody else might call, becoming more authentic, or, owning your power.
Or to evolve.
To evolve, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it seems like it is about evolution based on karmic dynamic, which I'm interested to know, what is your definition of karma? Because to me, it's became kind of clear that karma is restructuring of energy, considering how everything is energy presenting itself in different ways and different manners and different bundles of different summary of energy, basically. And it again, like a wave, it emerges from the ocean, it goes back, and then it emerges in a different kind of a way that it might seem to us that is random, but there also can be some kind of a connection. That the wave is happening because other waves has happened the same, the way that they happened.
Well, so I went on this trip to Oregon recently, a road trip, and on the coast, and there's this place that we visited where you've got this rocky coast and this narrow channel that has the rocks are cut away and the water goes up it for like 100 feet. And when the waves hit it just right, they come in and they bang against the rock and they get funneled into that channel. And there's a hole in the rock above them, and it spouts out like a geyser in Montana, just shoots into the air. But it doesn't happen every time. It just happens when the alignment of the waves is right. So this is actually a good metaphor for the process I call retroactive event determination, which is very much like the notion that we live in a virtual reality, that events that haven't happened are not determined yet. I mean, events that we haven't observed are not determined yet. So think of it like waves on the ocean. You have these waves coming from different places, traveling thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean. And they're coming in together, converging on this point of land where they can go up this channel. And it's not until the last minute, depending on what's happening there at the channel, depending on the outgoing waves from the last approach, depending on the wind at that time, there's these other factors that determine whether these waves interfere and interact in a way that creates this spout. So it's not until the end result that we actually find out what's going to happen to these waves. Well, if these waves represent the different possible physical realities on what we are calling the multiverse, the branch on which I do take an action and the branch on which I don't take an action, or actually more to the point, the branch on which this person shows up at the airport with me, or the branch on which this person doesn't show up at the airport. So how does someone else's world interfere with mine? Those are these two different waves. It doesn't actually have a reality until the end point, when they collide and form this spout or not. But those waves have a history. So each of those branches have a long history of things that led to those people either being in my life or not being in my life. So to bring this to back around, everything you observe in the world, before you observe it, it has a long history of how it may have unfolded to get there, but it is not determined yet whether it's actually going to happen that way or not. And it's only in the observation, when the synchronicity actually happens, or the meaningful connection, that the entire history that made that necessary or possible becomes true. So this illustrates, these waves that have their long history, but actually only one of them becomes true in the end, is what I call retroactive event determination, which allows for this flexibility of history to unfold in a responsive way to our choices. Does that picture make sense?
Yeah, but the end that you're saying is being determined based on our subjective experience, because the spout itself is part of the process. The spout goes back to the ocean, and those waves were the way they were because of the waves that have been, for billions of years. And the spout is just a part of the process that is ongoing. So we contextualize it in a sense that it starts with a wave and ends with the spout, but that's based on our subjective experience of it.
Well, the contextualization is really important. So another example that's more physics-oriented, is looking at light from the sun. So the sun is 8 light minutes away, which means it takes 8 minutes for the light to reach us. Well, the essence of what my paper is showing, and people can find it on the journal Quantum Reports, it's called Space-Time Paths as a Whole. And what it shows is that the light that's emitted from the sun that eventually arrives on Earth, that journey has to be seen as one whole thing, not separate slices of time that we could travel along the light wave. Einstein asked what would happen if you caught up with the light wave. Well, what we think of as slicing time into steps. You're moving along time in a progression. To understand why this is not exactly right, think about special relativity, which is this theory of how space and time are interrelated in 4 dimensions. Well, when you get close to the speed of light, time slows down. And actually space shrinks also. So distances get smaller. So the closer you are to the speed of light, the distance between the sun and the earth gets smaller, relatively. Now, if you were to go the speed of light, which no human being can do, then those definitions of space and time would shrink away altogether. It's like an undefined case. It's called a null interval. But light does go at the speed of light. So this is actually what the description of light would be, that there's no separation between the sun and the earth, no separation between the beginning point and the end point. They're one event. And the physicist slash chemist Gilbert Lewis called this virtual contact. So these two things that are, obviously separate, me and the sun, because I'm sunbathing, are actually in virtual contact because there's actually this null interval of space-time between us. So this notion that the end point actually influences the middle point or the journey is very much a part of physics. It's actually part of what's called Lagrangian dynamics as well from the 1800s, part of classical physics too. The end point and the beginning point are part of a whole which determines which path is allowed.
Right. Yeah, and so is the sand that absorb the heat and give it back to your body, and the rest of it, it's all part of the same thing. It's just a matter of our experience of how we contextualize them. Yeah,
and so because there's different things you could do, you can measure it by laying in the sun and feeling the rays. You could also put a satellite dish and intercept it. There's these different outcomes that you could experience that are all after it left the sun. You could do that after 4 minutes of travel. It's got 8-minute travel to get to you, but after 4 minutes, you could do this different thing and change it. So how do you change something as a whole in the middle of its travel? These are some of the conceptual questions that I had to wrestle with in this paper. What it leads to is a very clear establishing that, first of all, measurement is relational. As you're saying, all measurement is subjective. It doesn't mean it's subject to our whims, but the measurement I make is a relationship between me and the thing I'm measuring.
Yeah.
It's actually not expanded beyond that until you come in and measure either one of us. And then you're part of that circle of correlation, right? And that's reality, is this subjective correlation versus there being some objective, physical, definite world out there. That doesn't hold up. And then when you look at the world that way, you also have to conclude that, and this is very controversial, objects as a whole, macroscopic objects like a satellite dish, are obeying the same principles of quantum superposition that microscopic particles are. They just have to, because light has traveled for 2 minutes along its journey. It is definitely a quantum mechanical system, but then you change your satellite position to be something else. It's a macroscopic object, and the journey of that light as a whole is changed. And so what you conclude is that the satellite dish also is part of that wholeness, and there's no way around that. But looking at it symbolically, you're able to start to see that objects as a whole have these properties. Quantum mechanics is a description of objects as a whole. And that's really the essence of my work in physics that ties it back into wholeness of perception.
It's also a perfect ground to get to panpsychism, right? That everything is conscious and having its own experience subjectively, that it's all one thing, but every element of it having its own experience subjectively. That, to me, that is God. That there is impossible to know the nature of it because it's everything.
Yeah. Well, so panpsychism is really close to the mark in my view, but I think it can be interpreted in ways that are misleading. It's this idea that, we still think that physical reality is the fundamental thing, like matter exists just on its own, and that every part of matter is imbued with consciousness. And that invites this whole argument, like, well, an electron, is it really conscious? If we had enough of them together, could they speak to us, or could we measure that consciousness? And I think this is the wrong way to understand panpsychism. My way of viewing panpsychism is the aligned with the Vedanta way from Indian Hindu mythology, that conscious awareness comes first. We experience matter inside of our conscious awareness. Every measurement we've ever made as a physicist is as aware human beings. And through tools that are, related to us also, that we're using to measure. So all of these experiences are within our awareness. And in that sense, conscious awareness is not present in every atom. Every atom is present in conscious awareness. And that's a different way of looking at panpsychism. But I think it's a fundamentally different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that you pointed out. How do you define consciousness?
That's a good question. When you can't figure something out in physics, you postulate it. but then you have to build, the price of that is you have to build everything else up out of that. Right? You can't just add it in and say, well, I just figure it is. You say, my postulate is that conscious felt experience is the primary aspect of reality that we're all experiencing. And from that, I try to then develop what the physics is. Physics comes from that. And that, I couldn't do that all right here. I've done some exploration of that in some of the papers I've written that have not been published, or that I've put in my books, for instance. But the basic, the tie in is the relationality, the subjectiveness of measurement, because that is based on an individual perspective. And this is a key point both in physics and I think in spirituality. In physics, for instance, in this formalism called consistent histories, you have this thing called the single framework rule, which is that in order to have a description of the physical world in time, which is consistent, you don't want inconsistency. That's like obviously going to be wrong in a model. The consistency requires what's called the single framework, which means that you have to choose a perspective with which to write all your symbols. And in that framework, it all makes sense. If you change the framework, in other words, the perspective or the subjective view, then the symbols have to change. And so they're still consistent with themselves, but these two views cannot be compared. And this is also seen in the relational model of quantum mechanics, which is related, that you have to describe or claim what your perspective is on the system to be able to describe it. And you can't just ad hoc say that there's an objective world that we're all describing, because you get contradictions. And this is essentially what allows synchronicity to unfold, because synchronicity is not an objective thing where, I meet someone at the airport and it's obviously a synchronicity with meaning. I might think, I've been looking for a partner for my business. I meet this person that's a good friend that I haven't seen in a long time. They're in the same field as me. It's meant to be, right? But then I'm coming at it with this attachment like it's meant to be, and then it doesn't end up being meant to be. Maybe it serves a different purpose. Maybe they turn me on to somebody else, a lead. Or maybe I just reconnect and have a nice conversation. So synchronicities don't have a set meaning. It is a subjective meaning based upon our subjective view. And I think that's related to this notion of having to choose a view and describe the world from that perspective.
This is an interesting question. I also noticed that you put it in one of the suggested questions in a different way, maybe. But do you feel like your understanding and sense of synchronicity itself creates a bias in studying and researching synchronicity?
Well, I think bias is an important question. I mean, the whole point of this tree in my model of synchronicity is called meaningful history selection, is that out of all the possible branches of the tree, we're biasing it towards the ones that are more meaningful to us. The difference between psychological meaning and what I call objective meaning, is the psychological meaning. You would argue with that, right? I might say, it's good to have my car drive over 60 miles an hour, and you say it's bad to have my car drive over 60 miles an hour. Yeah, that would be subjective. Yeah. We would disagree on the psychological meaning. That's right. I would say objective meaning is this notion of what does my action lead to on the branches of the tree. So if I have an exam tomorrow in school and I study for that exam, and if that's necessary, in some cases that might not be necessary. Maybe I'm somebody who does better when I don't study. But if I'm the kind of person that is going to do better when I study, because that branches of the tree have those predetermined paths in which I do better on the exam, then my decision to study or not study is meaningful. Because if I don't study, I end up on these other branches where there's these outcomes where I don't do well. And the idea is that not only is that an objective measure, because of course we can't see the branches, but there is a sense in which one branch leads one way and another branch leads another way, regardless of whether we value getting a good grade or not. The notion of synchronicity is also that if I do need to study, and that's sort of the right thing for me to achieve my goal, then I will also, and I do study, then that biases the branches of the tree to bring me a question which is one that I studied. So that's the synchronicity, is that the questions on the test are also open to what's the word I'm looking for? Retroactive event determination. Which questions ended up on the test is going to be partly influenced by how well I prepared. And if I studied this particular topic, that might be on the exam synchronistically.
And also who your teacher is, who come up with those questions.
Well, that's the causal aspect, right? Because that's clearly going to cause an effect. But like I had an experience where I was studying for a midterm exam. I got to school about 20 minutes early. We're all hanging out in the quad studying together, but I'm really working independently. And I overhear someone saying, "Hey," to somebody else, not me, "have you studied for the spin 1/2 problem," or whatever it was? And I just heard that, and I didn't register it at first. But then I thought to myself, you know what? I meant to study that, and I didn't. So I just opened my book, looked up that problem, refreshed my memory. Well, it was on the test. Mm-hmm. It was one of the first questions. And so that the synchronicity was that somebody around me put that information out there, and I picked up on it, and it allowed me to connect with the branch of the tree where there was this positive outcome. And that's just part of this flow of when we are acting towards our values, in the case of like wanting to do well in the test and I'm putting in effort, then circumstances will also start to unfold in our path, which allow that or support that journey, like the test questions being a certain way. And if we don't do that studying, then the implication is that there'll be some question. The one question we didn't look at, well, is the one that is worth half the score or something like that. And these are all aspects of the physical world that can unfold or revise themselves because the histories go back like those waves on the ocean. They have these long histories of which questions are going to be on the test. It's not until the end point that one of them becomes the actual one. And that is partially influenced, possibly, by what I choose to do.
How would you define free will? And how do you see the relationship between free will and synchronicity?
They're really connected, and destiny is in here, and fate. These are all interesting concepts. So I have this phrase that I use: fate follows free will, which is to say that free will comes first. We always have a choice of how we respond. And this is why I bring this whole conversation into the field of human experience and say that our choices matter, because it's our choices that are determining how we navigate through that branching tree and what kinds of synchronicities come our way, show up. And so that determines like what matters in the world is what we define that matters. And that's what brings the synchronicities along for us. So fate follows free will is saying that we make our choice and then synchronicity happens. So I make the choice to study hard, and then the person mentions the test question that I should study randomly. And that's a result of my fate first, my free will first, making the choice to act a certain way, and then getting this response from the cosmos. So I think I answered that, fate is following free will because we always have free will to choose.
But the free will should also be subjective, right? Because your choices are being made between the provided options that are limited to your experience, to your context. Like you're born in a place within a certain set of values and cultures.
That's right.
And that leads to, all other options. So it's not like absolutely free.
Right. No, we're all constrained by physical reality.
Right.
We're also constrained by social constructs. And the effort that I try to make with synchronicity and making sure people understand that this is a powerful tool is that what we can change is our mindset limitations. We look at what's possible for us if we grow up in a culture that frowns upon being an artist or a musician, and you're supposed to become a doctor or a lawyer. There are forces lined up against me becoming an artist or musician, but there is still the possibility for me to expand my mindset and decide for myself what kinds of actions I'm going to take. Not everybody has those options, but the question is, what options do we have within our mindset that we can expand?
Yeah, and those options and not the need, but the desire to make certain kind of choices, it goes back to alignment, that it is not something that you want it to happen. It is something that gotta happen. You just recognize it as a matter of alignment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people suffer in their lives. They have, midlife crises or whatever it might be as a result of having made choices that don't align with something inside of themselves that they weren't quite aware of when they were making those choices.
Yep. You
look at, the choices you make when you get out of college and choose a career, or even going to college or not, or whatever it might be. There's so many examples of this, entering a relationship and getting married or not. And it's later in life when we see the consequences down the road of that branch that we chose, that we decide for ourselves, is that in alignment with what I want to create for myself? It's not that being a doctor or a lawyer is good, or being an artist or musician is good. It's what's in alignment for me. And can I really make choices? What does it take to make choices moving forward that are in alignment?
Yeah, a lot of people do that, and then they muscle through. And at some point, they just like, I don't know, either they become really bitter and miserable, or they're like, hey, you know what? I'm just going to drop all of this and go and play guitar because that's what I always wanted to do. Like, good for you, man.
Yeah. I mean, I got that message pretty early on, seeing people who had those kind of questions show up in their older life, and reflecting for myself, like, that seems to be a common experience. As a physicist, I'm thinking, like, what's the pattern here? How can I make choices that don't lead me to that kind of crisis? And I haven't avoided crises by any means. But I've been asking myself that question: how do I stay in alignment with who I really want to be in my life, so I don't come to a point later where I'm in the wrong relationship or in the wrong job? And I've done that before, but early on I've realized this is not aligned, and I'm going to have the courage to leave this job before I'm booted painfully out, and have the crisis. And I think, one of the ways that we can avoid the crisis by early detection that we're out of alignment is by really welcoming discomfort. Because discomfort is a way that we learn that we're out of alignment. When we have an experience of shame or embarrassment or anger or fear,
Mm-hmm.
We tend to shut down, right? This is the closing off our options. The more we can use our willpower, free will, to open, to stay uncollapsed into that state, the more we have the ability to stay with the discomfort and see, what's it telling me? Is this job no longer working for me? Or does this relationship need to change for me to stay in it? Or do I just need to be able to play guitar every day? And what would that take for me to claim that boundary in my life? Different for everybody, but it's about noticing the discomfort in your life and honoring it and really learning from it before it becomes so big that it really disrupts your life.
Do you think this detection of alignment can be quantified? And what kind of made me think of this question is something you mentioned earlier, that if I, for example, blink my eye, you will notice. And it reminded me of someone who I had on a podcast. She's building a emotional intelligence, artificial intelligence.
Oh, cool.
That they're putting in cars. Well, it could be cool or it could be disastrous, depending on what they're going to do with that information. But
that's right. Yeah. Sell it to companies.
Yeah, I mean, what she was saying is that this, it reads your emotions on your face, for example, when you're driving, and they're like 400 data pieces per second that it generates, that this is, so it can determine whether you're sleepy, you're sad, and it also has purposes across board. But another one that she was mentioning was when you're doing public speaking, for example, this can read the room and tells you, how to shift and how to,
Wow. That's amazing. Well, I think, let's get away from whether it's dangerous or not. That depends on how we implement it, right?
Our intention, human intention right behind the tool.
What's really interesting here for me is that we are operating as machines in a way. I don't subscribe to the machine-like view at all. Free will and human soul and all those things are part of my view of the world. The words not so much, but I think that the title of my book being "The World is Programmed for Us to Heal, Grow, and Adapt" is about we're operating in this what I think is a virtual reality feeling space. Like, we don't even realize how controlled we are in our emotions. And you were talking about earlier being manipulated by the television or by media. And, I don't think that there's a person consciously thinking, I'm going to do this a certain way because I want control. I think everyone's sort of a megalomaniac in media, and they're trying to sell their products. But I think the bottom line is, even outside of media, just in people relating to each other, we're using emotions to manipulate the world. And we're controlled by emotions also, by other people's emotions. And I see this with my daughter, for instance. We sit down to do homework, and I ask her, do you have any homework today? And she's like, oh, I'm good. I'm working on my spelling. I say, well, do you have any math going on? She says, well, I have a math test tomorrow, And suddenly I get triggered, like, oh, I'm worried about it. And then I say something with the tone of my voice that she can detect. I guarantee it. And suddenly she's like, well, Dad, I'm in the middle of something. I'm like, well, go get your homework right now. We got to work on it. So now I'm taking control and inserting my emotions into her world. And we do this all the time with people. Our emotions get inserted into their reality, and it affects them. And I think we need to become better at understanding that dynamic. It's totally programmable. Like, it's not rocket science. I get angry in a small way. You're going to hear it in my voice. You're going to respond with an escalation of the same emotion. I'm going to hear that in you, and our words are going to be chosen a certain way. And this is how conflict sort of circulates as a tornado, a building storm. So we need to understand that, because that's controlling politics, it's controlling polarization, and we're caught in it. So there's this other option with my daughter. If I control my fear for her future, my fear about what it was like for me being in math class as a kid, all those things that are about me, by controlling that and my emotions, I stay in the middle. I don't express my impatience or try to insert myself in her reality. And then I can actually be there for her and probably get the outcome where we end up studying for the test together anyway. But she's now in charge, and I allow her to keep her own autonomy. And that is a much different outcome than the original outcome.
You have one kid?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how people approach this when they have like 2 or 3 different kids, right? Because not all of them destined for the same kind of a thing, yet your experience is similar towards all 3 of them, for example, that, hey, just do your math homework, all 3 of you. But maybe one of them, the math has, a total negative effect on that person's life to recognize something like that.
Right.
We have a teenager in home, my girlfriend's daughter. I've been with her for like 6-7 years now. She's 13. And it's been
my
interesting.
Daughter's 12.
Yeah, it's so how it's at that point that, hey, I don't really want to listen to you, but I'm kind of lost, but I'm also independent. So it's interesting.
It's such a great example of the conflicting emotions. Yeah. And I can see myself in that as an adult, talking with you and talking with other people in the world. We're much more controlled and aware, but at the same time, we're acting out the same sort of conflicting emotions. It comes back to the complementarity, right? My daughter has these complementary emotions. She wants my help, but she doesn't want to hear anything I want to say at the same time. And that's a real tension for her. And the more I can drop into compassion for that, where one minute she's saying, Dad, come here, I need your help. And the next minute she's yelling at me for overstepping my bounds. Like, that requires for me to get out of my head and understand, what it feels like to just open myself a little bit in compassion, feel my body, be present, be grounded, be strong. I think that allows the relationship to unfold optimally in flow. And that brings us into this notion of flow, which is like getting ourselves in alignment, out of our own way. And it's getting those emotions, those reactive emotions out of the way also, staying in the middle.
How do you see the role of technology? Because a lot of people are saying technology is kind of messing it up for humanity. I personally, and I've said it on this podcast many times, I don't even see the difference between the evolution of humans and evolution of technology. I think we have evolved the way we have because and by each other.
Absolutely. I think technology is not our saving grace because it's going to solve our problems, but it is allowing us to see ourselves more clearly, which will solve our problems. The reason we're having much more difficult conversations now around race and around politics and around polarization, around dictatorships, and all these questions, climate, all these questions are more able to be talked about at a deep level because we have so much more information that we're sharing, and you and I are sharing, whereas before we might have had to just listen to each other on CBS and not be able to go back and forth. So this technology, for me, synchronicity is always useful. It might not be positive. It might not be helping me with my problem. It might be hurting me or making me miss my plane. But it's always useful because it's always teaching me something about my choices in the past that have led to this point. And then how I can make different choices in the future that are more aligned with where I want to go. So I think technology is part of that. Technology is not good or bad. it's necessary for us to be developing this technology right now, and it's up to us to learn from it, just as it's always up to us to learn from the car, the automobile, or guns, or fire. All these technologies that really up to us to figure out, but they're absolutely necessary.
Yeah, tools and the intention behind the tool.
Yeah, and I think, right now this idea of virtual reality is so important, because I'm going to circle back to the world is programmed to help us grow and heal. Well, how does it do that? It does that by triggering us. It puts us in situations that are uncomfortable, where we have to survive and hopefully find a new way to survive that's not repeating the old patterns. So we have opportunity after opportunity to repeat a circumstance in different contexts. And gradually we evolve, hopefully. And it's very much like a virtual reality that's sort of unfolding in the moment for our use, for like a simulator. And this is possible for us to understand in a new way because we have virtual reality on our computers. We can visualize it. We've seen the Matrix. We have these models that make sense to us.
Speaking of synchronicity, yesterday I drove, I'm in South Florida, drove about 3 hours to see the launch of Inspiration 4, SpaceX.
Wow.
And this was my fourth launch, and all of them SpaceX, and every single time it is a spiritual experience to me when it happens. But when driving back, I listened to the Lex Friedman podcast with Jaron Lanier, who's a father of a virtual reality field.
Wow.
And the first thing he said is that virtual reality gives us the opportunity to appreciate this reality.
Yeah.
You go to virtual reality, and the hope is that when you're coming back, you appreciate more of the reality that you're living in. I thought it was
That's
really
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really agree. And this notion from virtual reality that's really important to understand is what I was calling retroactive event determination. You can understand what that means by thinking of it in this way. I use the analogy of the waves coming from far away, and it's not until the last minute that one becomes real and the other doesn't. Well, in the same way, when you're in a VR space, in a house, for instance, and you walk from the living room to the dining room, does the dining room exist before you walk in? No. I mean, it's bits that are programmed to appear a certain way.
Like video games.
But like video games, right? It gets constructed for you when you walk in. And it's actually constructed for you on your headset or your computer screen. And if there's another person in that room in Florida or in Australia or in China, that person has their own reconstruction of the same room, but it's a different reconstruction. But it's consistent with yours because there's a common, server that's serving up the data. So VR is made to work in exactly the way that I think the real world works, which is there's a relational, subjective nature to what you're experiencing. It's on your own laptop that you're experiencing all this stuff, but it's consistent with everyone else's experience because it's designed to be that way. And the question is, how does it maintain that consistency? Well, there's no objectivity there, right? There's no objective world that you're walking through. That's a really key piece, subjectivity in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Skye's book is called Leap to Wholeness, How the World is Programmed to Help Us Grow, Heal, and Adapt. What is one thing you want the readers to get out of the book?
The openness to explore that there is a bigger whole that you're part of, and that the views that you have right now, the opinions that you have of any of these issues that we've talked about today, or even of just the choices in your life, whether it's good to stay in your job or not, whether you should be angry at your spouse or not right now about what happened, that there is a wider perspective which has even more information than you're taking in right now, and that our journeys are to expand our perspective and that life is sending us the information necessary to do that. So to be open to that information without reactionariness, but with openness and receptivity and gratitude.
Amazing. Well, you're a very wise man, even though you're white. Well, I'm joking.
I'll take that as a compliment.
For sure. You should take it as a compliment. What is next for you, and where and how can our audience to follow your work?
I lead a monthly workshop on wholeness, synchronicity, and flow. And I go into some visuals that show you the science that we've talked about of holograms and the sun to earth light travel and special relativity and null intervals and these things, and how they relate to the wholeness as a human, and what it means to be a whole person and to expand our perspective. And in particular, I talk about filters and the way that we filter the world we see through our lens, which limits the whole down to what we can perceive, and having facility with that so that we can change those filters if we want to. So these workshops are once a month, usually the first weekend of the month, depending. And you can find all that information. There's a free webinar I also offer to lead up to that. That's all at physicsofwholeness.com. And my website generally is Synchronicity Institute, where you can sign up for things or find my books or just read blog posts. I do write on a regular basis.
Amazing. Well, do you want to talk a little about the Synchronicity Institute as well before we finish the show? What's
the
all about?
Synchronicity
Why was
Institute,
it created, and what kind of an objective it pursues?
Yeah, so we do both research, and it's really me and the people that I have around me to help promote the work that I'm doing and support what I'm doing. It's I've been doing this research for at least 10 years when I first started thinking in terms of the physics of synchronicity and light. But even 20 years when I started really thinking about synchronicity more broadly. And after, just a few years ago, I realized I really needed a structure to continue this research. And the Synchronicity Institute does both the academic research and publishing that I've done, and training and sharing this work in ways that really influence the way people think and feel, and give them more tools and facility to empower them to think in ways that are expansive and different from their habits, and to rethink those filters and give people more tools. So we do both research and training.
Amazing. Well, the first time you were here, I asked you the final question. I don't know if you remember, about alien. Come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization. What would be the worst thing humanity has done, and what would be the greatest achievement from your perspective? So you gave me an answer then. Feel free to give another answer. If you don't want to answer that, then I would ask you to give a message to the world and humanity. Your choice, whichever, or both of them maybe you want to answer.
Well, I think the worst things we've done, sort of spotted throughout history, the way that we've taken advantage of each other. We've seen each other as stepping stones, or things that we see nature as something we can exploit for our own benefit. So there's just this general notion that I can benefit from others by taking advantage of, or by hurting them. This notion that there's a zero-sum game, that if I benefit, someone else has to lose. In wholeness, when we see wholeness, we take actions which allow for all of us to thrive in a way that's collective. But I'm not sacrificing myself for the collective. It's a mutuality. And I think that's sort of the bad and the good, how to get from the bad to the good. Or I don't want to use bad and good, but from an alien perspective, that's what I would point to. And the message for the world is...
What is the greatest thing?
The greatest thing is that we have done that at times. We've come together. When things go poorly in the world, when 9/11 happened and people came together briefly in mourning, people are caring about each other. People are standing up for each other who wouldn't normally break out of their mental fog on a regular day because they're too caught up in their own lives. And we come together to support each other in our suffering. And I think we can do that kind of thing every day, to realize that everyone is on their journey of suffering and struggle, and we want to help, in whatever way we can to make that better for people. And that really just involves at an individual level, pulling out of our drama, pulling out of our story, and feeling good about ourselves so that we can, see what someone else is going through and empathize with it and hear their story. I think the best thing we can do is listen to each other's stories without reacting with our own, drama. So, and that would be the message for the world. Can we listen to each other with differing views without being triggered I'm not being triggered in my story to come back at you and try and change what you think, but actually be willing to be changed in what I think based upon what you tell me about your story and your view.
Excellent.
In fact, not even willing, but want to be changed.
Awesome.
Because I think that leads to, the more connection. We become part of a single whole when we do that.
Yeah, but providing more possibilities in order to explore the unknown, surf the waves, endless waves of this cosmic ocean.
Yes. And we do that by, we all have those experiences when we're playing sports together or at a stadium or playing music together or listening to, someone speak at a conference or a concert. We know what it's like to be connected to each other. We just have to leverage that feeling and what brings us there when we get in areas where we're more sensitive or triggered. And, we all have our political views. We all have our biases. That's a given. And I want to pull out of mine so that I can see who you are as a human being and see our similarities and connectedness. And I think that's absolutely possible, but it takes concerted effort and practice and discipline and strength.